If I was an international lawyer, I wouldn't be really concerned that all my work was about to dry up, I suppose. That's one way of putting it.
Conflicts of interest, brought to you by ACLED.
This is Conflicts of Interest. I'm Clionadh Raleigh.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Caitriona Dowd. It's 2026, and it's safe to say the last few weeks have been anything but quiet. The new year is here, Clionadh, so to speak, with a bang and not a whimper.
Yeah. And we both have colds, largely from drinking, I think. This coming Friday is apparently known as Quitter's Day, where most people give up on their New Year's resolution, which is pretty good to make it halfway through the month. On a separate note, Trump said his New Year's resolution for 2026 was world peace. And so I'm curious as to whether you believe he's going to give that up, Kat, or he's well on his way.
Whether that gives up first or the pronouncement that irony is dead, I'm not sure which one comes quicker, but we are today talking about what the US president has learned about imposing global power. So Trump told the New York Times recently that there was only, quote, one thing to limit his global power, quote, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me, end quote. I'm specifying quote there in case you thought that was coming from me. Those are the words of the president. He added, I don't need international law, which I think might be a sentence I would say if I wanted to signal to you that I was in some sort of state of duress over the phone. We don't need international law. So, Clionadh, if the only constraint on global power is personal judgment, is that a good thing, you would say, for stability and world peace in 2026? Or what do you think the prognosis is?
I think that for big kind of predatory powers, they weren't too concerned about international law at the first place. So if I was an international lawyer, I wouldn't be really concerned that all my work was about to dry up, I suppose. That's one way of putting it. But yeah, so he's really started seemingly as he means to continue, which is pretty bad, in that there was the national security strategy, which spoke about these spheres of influence. Along with that, I think people kind of assumed that you kind of stick to the activity within that sphere and that there is a certain amount of protection of those within it, right? By this major power who's going to carve up one of these spheres. I don't think either is true, but I'm curious as to whether or not you have been longing for an era of spheres of influence and where, well, I'll separately say where Ireland sits in it, but go on.
Longing for an era of spheres of influence. Yeah, I want a Cold War redux. I've just been jonesing for that. I think that yeah, greater rivalry, greater instability, and the certainty that the costs will be borne by civilians. That's absolutely what I was hoping for as we enter the new year. Absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing this across the board. This is not only a case of Venezuela, which of course we're going to talk about today, but we are just seeing this absolutely, it feels almost frantic exertion of US power and really just no pretense even. And I think that's something that's key and that's different in this occasion. You know, international law has not been a very visible constraint, or certainly a very visible constraint on the most committed and determined actors with sufficient power for a long time. But there has often been a pretense to, at least, I suppose, the facade of coalition building, of deference to international law, of rule of law, of legitimizing something as falling explicitly under a particular proviso. And we're just not even seeing the pretense anymore with the US. And we've seen a couple of things dressed up. You know, in this case with Venezuela, it's been presented as a kind of law and order sort of criminal target, sort of motivated targeting. But that's about as legal as the sort of the references get. Everything else, there's no alluding to it anymore, which I think is a significant shift.
Yeah, it's pretty random. I would say that there's a few interests within the administration, and if they get his ear, then Hegseth is on the phone the next moment, right? So Vance may have his ear about bombing Nigeria on Christmas Day, and Rubio clearly had his ear around Venezuela and Cuba. There was a lot of behind the scenes kind of, let's say mediation, but that's the wrong word for it, in the sense that the leader calls Trump and Trump says no, and then, decides to go in, a few days later. Apparently he's just said that the Iranian leader just did the same. So I think that Trump likes to portray himself as the person who's making these decisions, when I actually think a lot of this is different interests in the administration being able to say, now's the moment, right? Now's the moment to do it. And then him thinking, oh yeah, I get to boss people around, so I'll do it. I don't think that there's any thought beyond that. So if I was going to say what his limit is in in this predatory style, I would say that how stretched the American military can become and how many interests are really able to run these places even halfway decently, even in an extractive way, given his flurry of new pronouncements and potential areas of interest like Greenland or Cuba. Venezuela is a given, but elsewhere.
I think we do have to pause a moment for Nigeria because this is something we covered in a previous podcast, and you and I had both said we thought that action there was unlikely but would be devastating. I just want to add to that pronouncement that calling an attack on Christmas Day a Christmas present did give me the ick, I suppose, in a way that I have not had from a statement around conflict and violence in a long time. It is hard to trump kind of the feeling of just disgust and distaste that awakens. To call that a Christmas present, I think is
Yeah.
a new low for me anyway. I just think rhetorically,
Can I suggest that, like,
really
that's
hard to swallow.
exactly what it was designed to do, is to give people like you and me the ick? So it certainly wasn't designed to help out Nigeria in their security problems. It wasn't actually in a place where these marauders of Christians are located. And so I think it was just designed to create that in you. I'm sorry.
Thinking about design, because there's a lot of observations around like what is he doing? What's he actually seeking to achieve here? And I think you're right that there are many more interests beyond the individual, although the rhetoric and the positioning we're hearing a lot is about this individual and personalization of power and decision making. I mean, how does this differ, in your view, from previous US? The interest seems to be primarily about just shocking them into, I would say, compliance. The idea that you're just going to get a more malleable regime from decapitation, and that as a result, it's kind of a one done, move on. Now we've got the people we want in power.
US has never shown ability to learn from its previous mistakes and then apply it into their future mistakes. So the two episodes that are, I think, most useful to think about here is Panama in 1989, which happened on the same day. Similar sized problems to what the US has tried to deal with, in previous episodes, whether it's Iraq, etc. But what I will say is that I think they, and I mean the US administration here, obviously don't dwell on the trade-offs too much. Obviously, I think what's going to happen in Venezuela is there will be a fragmentation of that security structure and there will be explosive violence as they seek to redistribute authority and power. What I find really surprising about all of this is that the Venezuelans are totally kept out of it. I know that they're supportive in general of what happened, and that's a little bit of a strange, let's say, development here, which is that the general population is not against what happened. But I think that they are probably going to be very against what's about to happen, which is that they don't have an effective governance structure within their country. But they didn't feel like they've had that now for quite a while.
I take the point. There didn't seem to be great planning let's take the kind of classic examples of getting bogged down in this attempted regime change and interventions of things like Afghanistan and Iraq. Of course, the planning didn't appear with hindsight to live up to the realities that they faced. But I would say that months of coalition formation, of justification, of rationalization, of at least some pretense of deference to international institutions, even if those were not in the end terribly limiting or really effective in bounding some of those actions, was just completely absent here. Of course, there were people commenting on the buildup of military forces in the Caribbean, but not, I don't think, a strong anticipation that it would be this kind of action that we would see, targeted sort of regime decapitation. That didn't seem to be high on the list of possible outcomes. And I think you're absolutely right that it's going to be civilian populations that bear the brunt of it. That even if we see some kind of an elite deal, that the real sources of insecurity in Venezuela, which we haven't touched on here, but of course include things like just total, institutional and economic crisis and the hollowing out of the state, hugely fragmented conflict environment in which we have a huge number of pro-government and variously aligned militias active, as well as regional instability, that those are all going to carry huge implications for civilian security. And we're already starting to see that if you look at some of the early reports about kind of setting up of things like paramilitary checkpoints, roadblocks, increasing that kind of climate of fear, but also very real threat of violence for civilians in a context that has already seen huge human rights violations and repression in the last couple of years in particular.
I have very little time for international bodies. I think that the fact that they weren't at all consulted here will tell you exactly how important they are or how important they've become. Because you're right, they haven't checked US power. They haven't checked Chinese or Russian power. They haven't checked anybody's power in a very long time, but they have held a lot of meetings. Leave them out, you're basically saying they're not important. And they're unable to really tell us why they'd be important here. But I mean, to your point there about the carving up of places and what's going to happen, I think that we're in a situation here whereby all of these international institutions were created post-carve, right? So there are episodes where the great powers carve them out, and I'm in very dangerous waters here because I am not, as you know, an international historian about previous episodes. But these international institutions are created after we have some of these big geopolitical shifts. So you have a huge shift in these tectonic plates, and then these predators who effectively are leading these new spheres of influence, they start to combat each other, and that's what weakens them, right? And then new international institutions will come from that. But these ones have proven to be largely useless, and I don't think there's any coming back from it. I mean, what has the EU said that has been useful about this?
I think not on the EU specifically. I think on the broader point around institutions, I take your point. I mean, these are designed post some big shakeup, the UN being the obvious example of that, and we see them sort of crawling or sort of limping through the current period, not fit for purpose. I think people who have advocated for UN reform, that it might be more equitable, that it might be more inclusive, would look at the current state of geopolitics and say, actually, maybe this isn't the right time. As in, maybe the window in which that might have been effective as a break on global insecurity has passed, because to open up the UN sort of rule book now and say, okay, let's reconfigure, like, who deserves a permanent seat, who deserves veto power, at a time when human rights, when civil society space, when kind of a general commitment to multilateralism is under attack, that might not be the right, that critics would say that isn't the right time to do that, because you don't know what Pandora's box you're opening. Now, I think that in itself is flawed, because it suggests, it's the reason, as it were, that there has been a disengagement from some of these institutions by some institutions. But I think it's very attractive for the US and others to say multilateral institutions are inefficient. It's much faster, it's much better when we just solve things ourselves. And that's really the claim here, I think, that the US administration is basically saying, let's get it done. It's sort of marketing itself as the get stuff done. We don't need to go through 1,000 hoops. We don't need to justify this in terms that we don't support or acknowledge as legitimate. And yet, I suppose what's important in my perspective is highlighting that the costs of that they don't disappear. They're just deferred.
So if he's got a map on his hands and he's just throwing darts at it. We've got Colombia, for which he said Colombia is very sick, run by a sick man who likes to make cocaine and selling it to the United States. This is somebody who just let go of a former president of Honduras who was actually implicated, but also tried successfully for doing just that. Cuba, there's no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. Make a deal before it's too late. Of course, Cuba has a very advantageous place within the Caribbean. That might be an area of interest. But actually, I do think that that's related to the fact that the Republican Party, and potentially who's ever a successor to Trump after this, will get every single Latino vote in the US if these countries are successfully taken. Greenland, where he said, in fact, it was a great discussion he had where he started with, we're thinking about it. And then at the end of this interview, he was like, we're taking it. So he's convincing himself at all times. Poor Greenland does look like it's very much in the next firing line. Mexico, we're going to start hitting now with regard to cartels. The cartels are running Mexico. It's very, very sad to watch and see what's happened to that country. Violence between the cartels in Mexico has decreased as of last year with the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, although it is still extremely high. There's no two ways about it. And of course, Nigeria, I'd love to make it a one-time strike, but if they continue to kill Christians, this will be a many-time strike. I mean, I do think that people should potentially look back at what Hegseth said at the beginning of his tenure, where he said, we have this military, we might as well use it. So that's as much of a motivation as there is a geopolitical strategy in those particular countries. But I'm curious about what you think about that list. Canada's not on there, and I do think that Canada is not free.
I think of that list particularly, I think if there's any constraint on Trump's power, it's not morality. I do think that the fact that, let's take Venezuela, was internationally isolated to a greater degree than some of those states on that list are, made it a more attractive target. I'm not suggesting that that was determinant, because clearly the administration's mind was set on it, but I think that creates a sort of a slightly more conducive environment. And with that, I would be inclined to rank from most to least likely. I would still be inclined to put Greenland, I think, on the less likely list. I think the geopolitical shift that would entail, I think, is very, very significant indeed if we were to see some kind of use of force to capture or otherwise claim Greenland.
I mean, I'm not even sure if they'll get to claim it entirely. I think they'll kind of just claim squatters' rights or something. I mean, like there'll be some way around
Yeah.
it.
It could be, I mean, whether it becomes some kind of, Djibouti-like situation with an enormous presence. But yeah, I think international isolation was a factor in Venezuela that isn't so clear in some of these, and I think that may still be, to an extent, a break on that. But I think what's more striking about this list, is, I mean, as you said, geographically it's all over the place. This is not just about isolated incidents. This is about a pattern of unilateral force, highly personalized decision making.
It's entirely realism. It's entirely power politics, and it's looking for opportunities. It's not harnessing grievances in order to make a case. So I think that is the seismic change that I think we all need to get our head around. The fact that so many international institutions were quiet, and so many of even governments in the West, this mealy-mouthed nonsense about how no one really appreciated, like no one wanted Maduro in that position. But, they shouldn't have done it that way. Who cares? Who cares? Drives me nuts. It really does. No one cares what we think, and we're actually not giving any good advice about what's going to happen unless we unleash this idea that what do predators do when they're predating, both on the weaker states but with each other?
No one cares what we think. We're not giving any good advice. Join us next time for more, more of the same.
You've been listening to Conflicts of Interest, brought to you by ACLED, with Professor Clionadh Raleigh and Dr. Caitriona Dowd. New episodes are available every fortnight. Follow ACLED socials for more in the meantime.